The air stank of ash and machine oil, the ruins of a once proud imperial city now nothing more than a graveyard of stone and steel. Through shattered windows and blackened alleyways, the whispers of something unholy threaded the silence. Unnatural murmurs that seemed to rise not from a throat, but from the fabric of reality itself. In such a place, where the very air pressed upon the lungs like wet cloth, a single guardsman might be the final line between order and oblivion. His lasgun was little more than a torch against the night, his flak armor no shield against what clawed at the veil. Yet he stood there, breathing, waiting, clutching to the one thing no demon could ever take from him: the stubborn refusal to surrender. And in that heartbeat you cannot help but ask, how long can any mortal man truly survive against chaos? Before we descend into this labyrinth of desperation and defiance, allow me one simple request. If you wish to walk deeper into this story, if you want to see the Warhammer universe not as ink on parchment, but as fire and blood and breath, then stay with me. Lend a moment to like this piece, to share it with others who hunger for the same visions, and to join this channel for journeys that will only grow darker, sharper, and more unrelenting. Your presence is the lifeline that lets stories like this one endure. The city had already died before the first shot was fired. Its streets were choked with dust and broken glass, its spires split and gutted by artillery that had fallen from the heavens like thunderbolts. The banners of the Imperium still clung stubbornly to ruined walls, their once proud Aquilas now torn and blackened, swaying in the acrid winds that funneled between skeletal towers. It was through this carcass of civilization that the Guardsman moved, one step at a time, lasgun gripped so tightly his knuckles showed white through grime. His regiment had landed 3 days earlier, but the line between day and night was already meaningless. There was only smoke, fire, and the low drone of something vast moving far beyond sight. The first hour after contact with chaos is not marked by courage, nor by noble speeches that echo across Vox networks. It begins with silence, the kind of silence that gnaws at the nerves until every echo feels like a threat, every shadow like a claw reaching for the throat. In that silence, the Guardsman breathed through his teeth and told himself that this was just another war, just another uprising, just another city turned hostile by whispers of heresy. He repeated the catechisms drilled into him by the commissar, though the words trembled on his tongue. His boots scraped across rubble and bone alike, and he did not stop to see which was which. Then came the sound, not the sharp crack of a rifle or the ordered bark of an officer, but a low chorus, like a choir buried deep beneath the earth, straining against its tomb. It made the air itself vibrate. It set his teeth on edge and his eyes watering. He stumbled, clutching the stock of his lasgun tighter, blinking against the sudden burn in his vision. All around him, fellow guardsmen reacted the same. Men who had crossed deserts and void black seas without flinching now swore under their breath, crossing themselves in the sign of the Aquila. The Vox grills hissed with static, officers shouting for discipline, but the static swallowed their words whole. When the first figures appeared, it was almost a relief. At least they could be seen, at least they had shape and form, unlike the pressure that had built in the air. They came shambling down the boulevard, their silhouettes warped by the heat haze of burning promethium. At first they seemed like men, renegades, traitors, once Imperial soldiers now arrayed in scavenged armor. But the closer they drew, the less human they became. Some still bore the heraldry of the Astra Militarum, though it was warped, twisted, eaten away by rust that spread like infection across ceramite plates. Others had skin that glistened too wetly in the firelight, their mouths stretching too wide. Their weapons fused into their arms as though flesh and metal had forgotten their boundaries. The order to fire came not from command, but from fear itself. The guardsman lifted his lasgun and squeezed the trigger, the beam of red light lancing through the smoke and catching one of the traitors square in the chest. The figure staggered but did not fall. Another volley came, and another, the crack of lasfire filling the air until the boulevard glowed red with scattered shots. Some of the warped shapes dropped, their flesh hissing where it charred, but too many pressed on, shrieking in voices that no human throat could form. The first rush was chaos. The guardsman fired until his power pack whined with heat, sweat dripping down his neck, the stink of ozone thick in his nostrils. His comrades screamed around him, some in defiance, others in agony. The street became a cauldron of light and shadow, las bolts cutting through smoke as warped blades and spiked clubs slammed into flak armor. The guardsman's shoulder jarred as a comrade beside him was thrown backward, his throat split open by something that might once have been a bayonet, but now writhed like a living thing. Blood sprayed hot against his cheek. He did not remember aiming the next shot. He did not even remember pulling the trigger. But when his vision cleared, there was a corpse smoldering before him, its skull split open by light. The guardsman staggered back, chest heaving, bile rising in his throat. Training told him to close ranks, to cover his brothers in arms, to press the line. Instinct told him to run, and caught between those two truths, he hesitated for a single heartbeat too long. It was in that hesitation that he first truly heard them. Not the shrieking of the enemy, nor the cries of his regiment, but the whispers. They crawled at the edges of his thoughts, threading through his mind with a softness that felt almost tender. Promises, half-formed, draped in the voices of people he had once known. His mother's voice, his drill sergeant's, his own echoing back at him in mockery. They told him he would die here, that the Imperium had already forgotten his name, that his blood was nothing more than another drop in an ocean that no one would remember. He pressed the butt of his laser gun against his chest as though the metal might block the voices. He whispered the Emperor's name, hoarse, broken. But the whispers did not recede. They laughed. They lingered. They twisted the syllables of his prayer into something obscene. And still he stood, feet rooted to the ground, laser gun clutched like the last plank of a sinking ship. The first hour had only begun. The screams had become part of the air. They rose and fell like a tide, punctuated by the rasp of last fire and the dull thuds of bodies hitting rubble. The guardsman's world shrank to a tunnel, his vision locked on the iron sights of his weapon, the weight of the trigger beneath his finger. Every shot was a prayer, every discharge a desperate attempt to hold back the tide for one more heartbeat. His ears rang, and yet beneath the ringing, he could still hear the whispers threading through his skull, taunting, coaxing, patient as serpents. He dropped to one knee behind a half-collapsed hab wall, teeth clenched against the acrid smoke that seared his throat. Around him, shapes darted through the haze, comrades in the same ragged flak coats, their faces masks of grime and terror, firing blindly into the dark. Somewhere further down the boulevard, a Vox unit crackled to life, its distorted voice urging them to hold, to remember their oath, to stand fast for the Emperor's glory. But the Vox died in a wash of static before the sentence ended. The enemy was upon them again. A figure vaulted over the wall with the weightless grace of something inhuman. Its armor had once been Cadian issue, green fatigues and standard chest plating, but the flesh within had burst its seams, swollen with tumors and ridged with scales. The guardsman fired point blank, the lasbolt scorching a hole through the creature's jaw. It collapsed into him, twitching, and he shoved the smoking carcass aside, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. His hands shook as he reloaded, the power pack sliding into place with a click that felt like salvation. There was no rhythm to the fighting, no order. It was slaughter in fragments, scattered down broken avenues where comrades screamed each other's names only to be cut off mid-syllable. The guardsman glimpsed a sergeant waving his chainsword in defiance before a bolter round from somewhere unseen burst his torso into a red mist. A moment later, the chainsword clattered against stone, still humming with teeth. The guardsman wrenched his eyes away. To see too much was to falter, and faltering was death. He pushed forward, boots slipping on blood and ash, trying to link with the nearest survivors. His section had been 30 strong at drop. He could count maybe 10 within shouting distance now. 10 men and women clutching their weapons like anchors, faces hollowed by disbelief. In the corner of his eye, he saw Private Mallory, one of the fresh recruits from Gathalamore, stumble and fall. Her scream turned into a gurgle as claws dragged her into the shadows. He almost broke ranks to pull her back. Almost. Training screamed louder than mercy. Hold the line. A sudden concussion tore the air apart, and rubble rained down from above. The guardsman was thrown to the ground, ears bleeding, mouth filled with dust. Through the haze, he saw the cause, a war machine lumbering into view, its silhouette hulking, plated in rusted iron covered with blasphemous runes. It belched smoke as it advanced, weapons fused with living sinew, a cannon's barrel that writhed like a serpent's tongue. Each step cracked the pavement, and each breathless second drove the guardsman further into the knowledge that this was no human war. The guardsman almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that never left his throat. Reinforcements were promises, not truths. In the trenches, there were only the men beside him, and the endless hunger. When night fell again, if it had ever lifted, he dreamed with eyes open. Shapes moved in the dark, not demons, not traitors, but men who should not have been there. His brother, long dead on another world. His squad sergeant from training, face split open but still smiling. They crouched beside him, whispering, asking if he remembered the taste of bread fresh from the oven, if he remembered the sweetness of amasec shared in secret after lights out. He shook his head, pressed his palms against his temples, But the memories came anyway, so vivid they ached. The trench was no protection against them. Hunger made the mind porous, soft, easy prey. The guardsman felt himself fraying at the edges, each hour unraveling thread by thread. He pressed his back against the mud, lifted his laser gun to his chest and closed his eyes. He did not pray for food. He prayed only for endurance, to last long enough to see another dawn, even if that dawn brought nothing but fire. The trench stank of rot, not only of the bodies half buried in its mud, but of living men decaying slowly from the inside out. Hunger stripped them one by one, peeling away discipline, peeling away the facade of strength. The guardsman saw it in their eyes first. The glassy stare of men who no longer bothered to focus, who spoke only in mutters that drifted off before they found an end. Then he saw it in their hands, trembling as they loaded last packs, fumbling straps as if their fingers no longer remembered how to work. The commissar's barked orders still echoed across the lines, but even his voice was thinner now, a sharp edge dulled by exhaustion. The guardsman gnawed on another ration scrap, the taste sour, metallic, almost unchewable. He forced it down anyway, knowing he would retch later, and knowing that to refuse was to court death faster. His tongue felt coated with ash, his teeth aching from grinding. Every swallow felt like swallowing gravel. He pressed a hand to his stomach, trying to steady the cramps. They would pass. They always passed. Beside him, Henrik coughed wetly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His beard clung to his face in clumps now, half burned, half matted with filth. He muttered something under his breath, a half-remembered prayer perhaps, though the words were lost in the wind. The guardsman leaned closer, but Henrik only shook his head, lips pressed thin. They both knew that prayers were easy prey for whispers. To speak them aloud was to risk hearing them answered by something else. The stillness of the trench was broken by sudden movement, a figure scrambling up the mud wall, vaulting onto the ruined boulevard. "Food!" someone hissed after him, but it was too late. The deserter was gone, stumbling into the smoke. The commissar raised his bolt pistol, tracking the man's shadow, but hesitated. To execute him was justice. To waste a bolt round was folly. In the end, the pistol lowered. They all heard the scream that followed, cut short by wet tearing, and no one spoke of it. Time thickened. The guardsman marked it not by sun or moon, but by the rhythm of the wounded. Their groans rose and fell like a tide, sometimes swelling, sometimes ebbing, until silence claimed another one, and the tide grew weaker. He tended to them when he could, dragging them against the trench wall, pressing torn fabric into wounds that would not close. He was no medic. None of them were. They were only hands holding back death for a little while. Then the supply drop came. It fell from the sky like a miracle, a crate parachuting down through smoke, its impact rattling the trench. Men rushed to it with wild eyes, tearing at the locks, voices cracking with desperate hope. But when the lid broke open, the hope curdled. Ammunition, bandages, no food, no water, just more tools to kill and to delay dying. The commissar declared it a blessing, his voice iron, but the words rang hollow in their ears. The guardsman saw men's shoulders slump, saw hunger cut deeper than wounds. A few forced cheers for the emperor, but most only stared at the empty sky. That night, he lay awake with his laser gun across his chest, listening to the faint drip of groundwater into the muck. His mind conjured food again, not in whispers this time, but in memories. He remembered the bread stalls of home, steam rising in the cold morning air. He remembered his mother's stew, thick with vegetables, the kind of meal that filled every corner of the belly and left a man warm. The memory twisted, warped, until he could smell it in the trench. He jerked upright, heart hammering, only to realize the scent was real. Not stew, but cooked flesh, carried on the smoke of burning bodies. He gagged, bile rising, and pressed his face into the crook of his arm. Hunger made every sense a torment. The guardsmen realized then that this was not simply endurance. It was erosion. They were being hollowed out, not by enemy fire, but by the slow, relentless gnawing of need. And in that hollow space, the whispers grew louder. The third week without proper rations broke something in the trench. It wasn't sudden, not like a shell or a charge, but gradual, like a rope fraying strand by strand until only a thread remained. That thread was hunger, stretched taut across every man's face. Their cheeks sank, their eyes grew dull, and every word became shorter, clipped, wasted. The trench no longer held soldiers. It held husks. The guardsman's belly was an empty pit that no amount of stale ration could fill. He chewed dried fiber until his gums bled, swallowed mud-thick water that tasted of rust and old bones. His dreams when he could sleep were of food, banquets that vanished as soon as he lifted a fork, whole roasted beasts that turned to maggots in his hands. In one dream, he was feasting at the Emperor's table, but when he looked up, it was not the Emperor at the head, but a figure of shadow and flame, smiling through jagged teeth. Awake was worse. Awake meant seeing his brothers breaking. The whispers were there too, low and constant, promising relief. Not victory, not survival, just relief. Relief from the gnawing, relief from the endless ache. Sometimes they took the form of imagined voices calling from no man's land, urging them to come and eat. Other times it was only the quiet suggestion, the seed planted deep in thought, that there was meat enough already, lying cold and still in the mud at their feet. Henrik resisted longest. He still spoke the litany before battle, still touched the aquila etched into his armor, but even Henrik's prayers had grown faint. One night, the guardsman woke to find him crouched by a corpse, hands hovering, trembling, as if he could not decide whether to strip the body for gear or for something darker. When the guardsman whispered his name, Henrik started like a thief, eyes wide, then backed away and said nothing. They did not speak of it again. Others were not so strong. The guardsman knew. He pretended not to see when a boot disappeared beneath a cloak. He pretended not to hear when wet chewing replaced the sound of snoring. The commissar surely knew as well, but his pistol stayed holstered. Even he was gaunt now, his cheekbones sharp as blades. Perhaps he weighed justice against survival, and found the scales no longer balanced. Perhaps he too heard the whispers, and wondered if the punishment would matter when the sin was already in all of them. The guardsman tried to hold himself apart. He forced himself to think of duty, of the Emperor's light, of the oath he had sworn. He whispered to himself when the voices grew too loud, reciting the names of those he had lost in earlier battles, as though their memory could anchor him. But the anchor was slipping. He felt it each time he woke with his mouth watering at the smell of roasting carrion, each time his hands trembled toward the fallen. Then came the night of fire. A chaos bombardment lit the sky crimson, shells hammering into the trench until the earth itself shook. Men screamed, soil collapsed, bodies tumbled into one another. The guardsman fired blind, smoke stinging his eyes, ears ringing. In the chaos, a gap opened in the line. Shapes poured through, twisted silhouettes with claws and horns, their laughter like steel scraping bone. The guardsman fought, bayonet slick with ichor, lasfire searing holes in the dark. But the real terror was not the enemy. It was the hunger inside him, driving his arms with feral strength, snarling in his chest as though it too fought for a kill. When the attack broke and the trench was theirs again, the survivors slumped in silence. Corpses lay strewn across the mud, friend and foe alike. The guardsman collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, mouth dry as sand. His lasgun slipped from his hands. He watched as men stumbled among the bodies, not searching for weapons, not tending to the wounded, but choosing what pieces of flesh might fill a stomach for one more night. He shut his eyes, but shutting them did nothing. He could still hear the sound, soft and wet, like lips at a feast. The hunger inside him growled. It would not be denied forever. He knew then that survival was no longer about courage or faith or even strength. It was about what he would do when the whispers spoke his name and offered him a choice. The first signs of madness were not the screams. They were the silences. Men who once muttered prayers through the long hours of watch began to stare without sound, lips moving against no words. Their eyes reflected nothing, neither firelight nor fear, as though their souls had already marched away. The guardsman noticed it most when he looked at Henrik. The guardsman almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that never left his throat. Reinforcements were promises, not truths. In the trenches, there were only the men beside him and the endless hunger. When night fell again, if it had ever lifted, he dreamed with eyes open. Shapes moved in the dark, not demons, not traitors, but men who should not have been there. His brother, long dead on another world. His squad sergeant from training, face split open but still smiling. They crouched beside him, whispering, asking if he remembered the taste of bread fresh from the oven, if he remembered the sweetness of amasec shared in secret after lights out. He shook his head, pressed his palms against his temples, but the memories came anyway, so vivid they ached. The trench was no protection against them. Hunger made the mind porous, soft, easy prey. The guardsman felt himself fraying at the edges, each hour unraveling thread by thread. He pressed his back against the mud, lifted his lasgun to his chest and closed his eyes. He did not pray for food. He prayed only for endurance, to last long enough to see another dawn, even if that dawn brought nothing but fire. The trench stank of rot, not only of the bodies half buried in its mud, but of living men decaying slowly from the inside out. Hunger stripped them one by one, peeling away discipline, peeling away the facade of strength. The guardsmen saw it in their eyes first. The glassy stare of men who no longer bothered to focus, who spoke only in mutters that drifted off before they found an end. Then he saw it in their hands, trembling as they loaded last packs, fumbling straps as if their fingers no longer remembered how to work. The commissar's barked orders still echoed across the lines, but even his voice was thinner now, a sharp edge dulled by exhaustion. The guardsman gnawed on another ration scrap, the taste sour, metallic, almost unchewable. He forced it down anyway, knowing he would retch later, and knowing that to refuse was to court death faster. His tongue felt coated with ash, his teeth aching from grinding. Every swallow felt like swallowing gravel. He pressed a hand to his stomach, trying to steady the cramps. They would pass. They always passed. Beside him, Henrik coughed wetly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His beard clung to his face in clumps now, half burned, half matted with filth. He muttered something under his breath, a half-remembered prayer perhaps, though the words were lost in the wind. The guardsman leaned closer, but Henrik only shook his head, lips pressed thin. They both knew that prayers were easy prey for whispers. To speak them aloud was to risk hearing them answered by something else. The stillness of the trench was broken by sudden movement, a figure scrambling up the mud wall, vaulting onto the ruined boulevard. "Food!" someone hissed after him, but it was too late. The deserter was gone, stumbling into the smoke. The commissar raised his bolt pistol, tracking the man's shadow, but hesitated. To execute him was justice. To waste a bolt round was folly. In the end, the pistol lowered. They all heard the scream that followed, cut short by wet tearing, and no one spoke of it. Time thickened. The guardsmen marked it not by sun or moon, but by the rhythm of the wounded. Their groans rose and fell like a tide, sometimes swelling, sometimes ebbing, until silence claimed another one, and the tide grew weaker. He tended to them when he could, dragging them against the trench wall, pressing torn fabric into wounds that would not close. He was no medic. None of them were. They were only hands holding back death for a little while. Then the supply drop came. It fell from the sky like a miracle, a crate parachuting down through smoke, its impact rattling the trench. Men rushed to it with wild eyes, tearing at the locks, voices cracking with desperate hope. But when the lid broke open, the hope curdled. Ammunition, bandages, no food, no water, just more tools to kill and to delay dying. The commissar declared it a blessing, his voice iron, but the words rang hollow in their ears. The guardsmen saw men's shoulders slump, saw hunger cut deeper than wounds. A few forced cheers for the emperor, but most only stared at the empty sky. That night, he lay awake with his lasgun across his chest, listening to the faint drip of groundwater into the muck. His mind conjured food again, not in whispers this time, but in memories. He remembered the bread stalls of home, steam rising in the cold morning air. He remembered his mother's stew, thick with vegetables, the kind of meal that filled every corner of the belly and left a man warm. The memory twisted, warped, until he could smell it in the trench. He jerked upright, heart hammering, only to realize the scent was real. Not stew, but cooked flesh, carried on the smoke of burning bodies. He gagged, bile rising, and pressed his face into the crook of his arm. Hunger made every sense a torment. The guardsmen realized then that this was not simply endurance. It was erosion. They were being hollowed out, not by enemy fire, but by the slow, relentless gnawing of need. And in that hollow space, the whispers grew louder. The third week without proper rations broke something in the trench. It wasn't sudden, not like a shell or a charge, but gradual, like a rope fraying strand by strand until only a thread remained. That thread was hunger, stretched taut across every man's face. Their cheeks sank, their eyes grew dull, and every word became shorter, clipped, wasted. The trench no longer held soldiers. It held husks. The guardsman's belly was an empty pit that no amount of stale ration could fill. He chewed dried fiber until his gums bled, swallowed mud-thick water that tasted of rust and old bones. His dreams when he could sleep were of food. Banquets that vanished as soon as he lifted a fork. Whole roasted beasts that turned to maggots in his hands. In one dream, he was feasting at the emperor's table. But when he looked up, it was not the emperor at the head, but a figure of shadow and flame, smiling through jagged teeth. Awake was worse. Awake meant seeing his brothers breaking. The whispers were there too, low and constant, promising relief. Not victory, not survival, just relief. Relief from the gnawing, relief from the endless ache. Sometimes they took the form of imagined voices calling from no man's land, urging them to come and eat. Other times it was only the quiet suggestion, the seed planted deep in thought, that there was meat enough already, lying cold and still in the mud at their feet. Henrik resisted longest. He still spoke the litany before battle, still touched the aquila etched into his armor, but even Henrik's prayers had grown faint. One night, the guardsman woke to find him crouched by a corpse, hands hovering, trembling, as if he could not decide whether to strip the body for gear or for something darker. When the guardsman whispered his name, Henrik started like a thief, eyes wide, then backed away and said nothing. They did not speak of it again. Others were not so strong. The guardsman knew. He pretended not to see when a boot disappeared beneath a cloak. He pretended not to hear when wet chewing replaced the sound of snoring. The commissar surely knew as well, but his pistol stayed holstered. Even he was gaunt now, his cheekbones sharp as blades. Perhaps he weighed justice against survival and found the scales no longer balanced. Perhaps he too heard the whispers and wondered if the punishment would matter when the sin was already in all of them. The guardsman tried to hold himself apart. He forced himself to think of duty, of the Emperor's light, of the oath he had sworn. He whispered to himself when the voices grew too loud, reciting the names of those he had lost in earlier battles, as though their memory could anchor him. But the anchor was slipping. He felt it each time he woke with his mouth watering at the smell of roasting carrion, each time his hands trembled toward the fallen. Then came the night of fire. A chaos bombardment lit the sky crimson, shells hammering into the trench until the earth itself shook. Men screamed, soil collapsed, bodies tumbled into one another. The guardsman fired blind, smoke stinging his eyes, ears ringing. In the chaos, a gap opened in the line. Shapes poured through, twisted silhouettes with claws and horns, their laughter like steel scraping bone. The guardsman fought, bayonet slick with ichor, lasfire searing holes in the dark. But the real terror was not the enemy. It was the hunger inside him, driving his arms with feral strength, snarling in his chest as though it too fought for a kill. When the attack broke and the trench was theirs again, the survivors slumped in silence. Corpses lay strewn across the mud, friend and foe alike. The guardsman collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, mouth dry as sand. His lasgun slipped from his hands. He watched as men stumbled among the bodies, not searching for weapons, not tending to the wounded, but choosing what pieces of flesh might fill a stomach for one more night. He shut his eyes, but shutting them did nothing. He could still hear the sound, soft and wet, like lips at a feast. The hunger inside him growled. It would not be denied forever. He knew then that survival was no longer about courage or faith or even strength. It was about what he would do when the whispers spoke his name and offered him a choice. The first signs of madness were not the screams. They were the silences. Men who once muttered prayers through the long hours of watch began to stare without sound, lips moving against no words. Their eyes reflected nothing, neither firelight nor fear, as though their souls had already marched away. The guardsman noticed it most when he looked at Henrik. His friend sat with his lasgun across his knees, fingers clenched so tightly around the grip that his knuckles split and bled. But his gaze was distant, locked on some phantom horizon only he could see. The trenches had always been haunted. The dead did not stay buried. The earth spat them up after every bombardment, arms clawing toward the sky as though even in death they longed to escape the mud. But what came now was not the natural horror of war. It was the quiet seeping of something greater, the presence of eyes unseen pressing in from every angle. The guardsman felt it when he tried to pray, when the words of the catechism of protection faltered on his tongue. The syllables seemed wrong, inverted, as if each verse turned upon itself the moment it left his lips. It was not only prayer, the air itself felt different. The wind no longer carried the dry taste of ash but something sweeter, cloying, like rot disguised as perfume. At first he thought it was his imagination, but then the others began to smell it too. Some gagged, others inhaled greedily, as though the scent alone promised relief. The guardsman tried to turn away, tried to breathe through cloth, but the sweetness lingered, worming its way into his chest, until every exhalation felt like surrender. Voices rose soon after, not the whispers of hunger, not the groans of the dying, but songs, thin, broken voices humming melodies no one remembered learning. At night, men sang them under their breath while they worked their bayonets against the trench walls. The tunes wound through the dark, weaving together until the entire line seemed to echo with a chorus not of men, but of something vast and unending. The guardsman pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound found its way through bone, humming along his spine. Sleep grew dangerous. When his eyes closed, visions bled through the cracks of thought. He saw endless halls of brass, spires that bent and twisted under their own weight, figures without faces kneeling in eternal supplication. He woke each time drenched in sweat, fingernails bloody from clawing at the earth. Henrik woke screaming, his throat raw, begging forgiveness from a master he could not name. Others stopped waking altogether. They simply sat down, stared forward, and never moved again, their bodies' empty shells still warm to the touch. The commissar fought the decay with iron will. He paced the trench each night, reciting litanies in a voice that cracked from thirst, dragging men to their feet, forcing them to respond. "You are servants of the Emperor," he roared, though his eyes betrayed cracks of their own. His voice wavered, his hand trembled on the holster of his bolt pistol. The guardsman wondered if he shouted so loudly not to save the others, but to drown out the song in his own skull. But madness is patient. It does not break all at once. It drips, it leaks, it seeps into thought until even discipline becomes another chain dragging the mind toward despair. One morning, the guardsman caught Henrik carving into the stock of his laser gun. Not prayers, not names, but spirals, circling, inward, tighter and tighter until the wood itself splintered under the pressure. When asked what it meant, Henrik only smiled, lips cracked and bleeding, and whispered, "It's beautiful, can't you see?" The guardsman struck the gun from his hands, desperate to break the moment. But the damage was done. For a flicker, he saw beauty in the pattern too, a perfection that made his heart ache. He recoiled in horror, forcing his gaze away, but the shape remained etched behind his eyes, as though he had memorized it against his will. The silence in the trench deepened after that. Not calm silence, not restful, but the silence of breath being held before a scream. Every man felt it. Every man knew the scream was coming. They only did not know when or whose mouth it would tear its way out of first. It began with laughter. Not the laughter of mirth, nor even the bitter chuckles soldiers shared when death brushed too close. This was jagged and hollow, like bones clattering inside a drum. The guardsman heard it first from a dugout, a single soldier cackling into the dark, his voice rising higher until it broke into shrieks. Others joined, one after another, until the trench reverberated with hysterics that drowned out even the distant thunder of artillery. The commissar shot two before the sound stopped. For a time the men were silent again, but the silence did not bring relief. It was heavier now, thick with the knowledge that their minds were no longer their own. The guardsman could feel the edges of his own reason fraying. His hands shook even when he tried to still them. Every shadow seemed to move. Every glance from his brothers seemed too long, as though they were watching him, measuring him. He told himself it was paranoia, a trick of exhaustion. But when he looked into Henrik's eyes, he saw a stranger staring back. Once filled with fire and faith, Henrik's gaze now shimmered with something like awe, as though he beheld wonders no sane mind should endure. The whispers returned stronger than before. They no longer promised relief. They promised clarity. They told him the war could end, that he need only listen, need only open himself, and the gnawing hunger and endless fear would dissolve like mist under sunlight. The guardsman clenched his teeth, muttering the Emperor's name until his throat ached. Yet even as he spoke it, he wondered if the word meant anything in this place, or if the Emperor's light could even pierce soil so soaked in corruption. It was in that moment of doubt that the first true break came. A soldier named Carrick climbed out of the trench, barefoot, weaponless, arms spread as if in welcome. He strode into no man's land, mud sucking at his legs, eyes fixed on the blood-red horizon. The guardsman called out, so did Henrik, but Carrick did not turn. Bolts of lasfire whined overhead, enemy sharpshooters picking at the line, but not one touched him. He walked with calm, unhurried steps, until the fog closed around his shape and he was gone. Minutes later, the laughter began again. This time, it came from every direction at once. Men started following. Not all, not in groups, but one by one, like moths abandoning the flame for the darkness beyond. Some muttered prayers as they climbed the trench wall, others wept, but all of them smiled. The commissar screamed orders, striking men with the butt of his pistol, dragging them back. Yet even he could not hold the tide forever. The trench was bleeding itself dry, not from enemy fire but from the madness whispering in their veins. The Guardsman fought it as best he could. He locked his arm around Henrik at night to keep him from rising. He tore strange carvings from the trench wall before they could spread. He forced himself to eat the filth they called rations, chewing until bile rose, simply to remind his body of duty. But each day grew harder. His dreams lengthened, visions sharpening. He saw towering forms striding across fields of skulls, their shadows falling across endless lines of kneeling mortals. He heard promises made in tongues he could not understand, yet the meaning was clear: surrender and be remade. The commissar fell at last when he turned his bolt pistol on himself. He gave no speech, no warning. One moment he paced the trench, shouting scripture with spittle flying, and the next the shot cracked through the night. His body collapsed against the mud wall, his pistol slipping from his grasp, his mouth frozen in the shape of one final word none of them could hear. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the whispers seemed to hold their breath. The Guardsman stared at the corpse, numb. He had expected rage, fear, perhaps even despair. Instead, he felt nothing. Just emptiness. Around him, men shifted, uncertainly, some clutching at their heads, others giggling softly under their breath. The pillar of their discipline had fallen, and with it the last barrier between them and the abyss. Henrik bent close to him, voice low, words shaking with fever. "Do you see it now? Do you hear it? They're calling us home." The Guardsman pulled away, but the words burrowed deep. He could not deny the pull any longer. Somewhere out there, beyond the trench, the song swelled louder with each heartbeat, and he knew it would not be long before he too was drawn to rise. The night the line collapsed began like any other. Mud, clinging to boots, the stink of unwashed bodies, the thin, sour smoke of last fire drifting in the air. But beneath it all pulsed a rhythm too steady to be natural. At first the Guardsman thought it was the beat of his heart. Then he realized it came from the ground itself, a slow thrum rising through the trench walls, vibrating in his bones. Men shifted uneasily, weapons clutched tight, though none spoke of what they felt. Speaking would make it real. The fog thickened, rolling across no man's land until visibility shrank to a few meters. Shapes moved within it, tall and bent, flickering in and out of sight. The Guardsman raised his laser gun, but the barrel trembled. He was no longer certain the figures were enemy. They looked too familiar. One resembled Carrick, his arms still outstretched, mouth open in a rictus smile. Another looked like a boy he had trained beside, long dead, yet grinning now with lips too wide to be human. When he blinked, they were gone. But the thrum in the earth grew louder. Henrik was the first to break. He dropped his laser gun, falling to his knees, hands clutching his skull. His screams tore through the trench like shrapnel, raw and desperate, until his voice cracked into laughter. The Guardsman lunged to grab him, to shake him back to sense, but Henrik shoved him away with sudden strength, eyes glowing with an unnatural gleam. "They're here," he whispered, tears streaking his cheeks. "Don't you see how beautiful they are?" Others followed. Some clawed their faces until skin peeled. Others tore at their uniforms, stripping themselves bare as though shedding all that bound them to the Imperium. The commissar's corpse still leaned against the wall, but no one looked at it anymore. The law, the order it had once represented, was ash in the wind. Then came the assault. Out of the fog charged twisted silhouettes, chaos marauders, their armor painted with runes that writhed like living wounds. The trench erupted in fire and screams. Last bolts seared the night, chainswords roared, flesh split beneath crude axes. Yet the true horror was not the enemy tearing into their line. It was the men who opened their arms to greet them. Guardsmen stepped forward willingly, offering their throats to the blades, their blood spilling in ecstasy rather than fear. Others fell to their knees before the invaders, chanting words not their own, voices merging seamlessly with the rhythm still pounding beneath the soil. The Guardsman fought because his body remembered how. His laser gun bucked in his hands, bayonet driving into corrupted flesh. He screamed the Emperor's name, though his voice was hoarse, though his faith felt brittle as glass. He fought not for victory, but to drown out the song that pressed in on every side. For a moment he thought he had held his ground. For a moment he thought survival was still possible. Then he saw Henrik again. His friend stood tall among the enemy, face split by a smile both radiant and terrible. Blood smeared his chest, not his own, dripping down in patterns that almost looked like the spirals he had once carved into his weapon. Henrik raised his arms, not in surrender but in welcome. Around him, guardsmen who had once been brothers joined the chant, their voices exulting in the slaughter, their eyes alight with zeal. The guardsman froze. His lasgun sagged. He could not raise it against Henrik, not against the man who had shared rations, who had carried him when his leg gave out, who had prayed beside him in the dark. Yet Henrik's eyes met his, and in them the guardsman saw not his friend but a reflection of everything waiting to claim him. The madness was not at the edge anymore. It was here, wearing the face of someone he loved. Something inside him broke. He turned and fled, stumbling through bodies and mud, scrambling up the trench wall into the fog beyond. Blastfire and screams faded behind him, swallowed by the song that pulsed louder, stronger as though chasing him. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs collapsed beneath him, until the world blurred into shadow. When at last he fell face first into the mud, silence closed around him. Silence but not peace, for in the silence he still heard Henrik's voice carried on the wind, whispering his name. The guardsman pressed his hands over his ears, eyes squeezed shut. But it made no difference. The whisper was inside him now, coiled like a parasite. And he knew the truth. Madness was not something you escaped. It was something you carried with you, forever. The guardsman did not remember how long he lay in the mud after the trench was lost. Hours, perhaps days. Time blurred when every heartbeat carried the echo of whispers. When at last he staggered to his feet, he was alone in the fog, his uniform torn, his weapon lost. He wandered with no destination, each step guided less by will than by some instinct that pulled him forward. Hunger gnawed, thirst cracked his lips, yet the true torment was the silence that pressed in around him. Not the absence of sound, but the silence of things unseen, watching, waiting. He found others, scattered remnants of the line, each broken in their own way. Some walked aimlessly, eyes vacant, their mouths moving in ceaseless prayer or gibberish. Others crouched in the mud, rocking like children, muttering liturgies twisted into nonsense. One man had etched the Aquila into his chest with a combat knife, lines carved so deep the bone showed through. When the guardsman tried to pull him away, he only laughed, blood bubbling in his throat, chanting a verse the guardsman did not recognize. Yet amid the madness, rumors began to take shape. Whispers carried from mouth to mouth, half-heard confessions murmured as if in a fever. Some said the emperor had stirred upon the golden throne, that his gaze now fell directly upon battlefields such as this. Others swore they had seen visions of light, beams piercing the fog, guiding the faithful toward salvation. Still others claimed the voices they heard were not chaos, but fragments of the master of mankind himself, shards of his will scattered through the warp to steady his people. The guardsman wanted to believe. He clung to the thought like a drowning man to driftwood. Perhaps the visions, the songs, even the madness itself were trials meant to burn away weakness, leaving only those strong enough to carry his light. But doubt lingered. If the voices were the emperor's, why did they drive men to slaughter their brothers? If his gaze truly fell here, why had Henrik's eyes gleamed with corruption rather than faith? One night as the remnants huddled in a shell crater, an old veteran spoke. His voice was low, cracked but steady. "The throne is not just a machine," he said. "It is a beacon. The Astronomicon burns because his soul burns. What if that light has grown too bright? Too vast for even him to contain? What if pieces of it spill into us? Not chaos, not corruption, but fragments of the divine we cannot endure." His words hung heavy, half prayer, half heresy. No one dared answer, but none turned away. The guardsman listened, torn between awe and terror. If the emperor's soul was indeed too vast, then what they endured was not invasion, but revelation. Madness not as disease, but as the weight of truth pressing upon minds too small to hold it. Yet the thought chilled him more than it comforted. For if that was true, then salvation lay not in survival but in surrender. Surrender to a light that would unmake them as surely as chaos. The next day, they saw it. A pillar of fire in the distance rising into the clouds, its glow too pure to be artillery, too steady to be a storm. The men fell to their knees, some weeping, others clawing at their faces as though blinded by its brilliance. The guardsman stared, heart pounding, torn between running toward it and fleeing into the earth itself. For within the light he thought he saw figures, tall, armored, golden. Custodians, perhaps, though no custodian would tread such a battlefield. Or perhaps angels, guardians long promised but never seen. Their outlines shimmered like heat haze, and when he blinked they vanished. Only the fire remained, steady and unyielding. Around him, the rumors swelled louder. "The Emperor walks. He calls us to him. This is the proving ground." The guardsman whispered none of these things aloud, but the words burrowed into him. Hope or delusion, it no longer mattered. In a world stripped of reason, even lies could feel like lifelines. And so he began to walk toward the fire, each step heavy with fear, yet driven by the need to know whether the light was salvation or only another mask worn by the enemy. The march toward the fire drew them together, broken men bound not by command but by desperation. The guardsman walked among them, each step dragging through the mire, his boots little more than rags. Around him trudged the hollow-eyed remnants of his regiment, if they could still be called that. No orders guided them, no vox crackled with direction, no commissar barked discipline. They moved like pilgrims, each man clutching his weapon as though it were both staff and relic, each gaze fixed on the distant glow. The fire grew larger with every hour, its light shimmering against the smoke-choked sky. Sometimes it flickered like a beacon, steady and reassuring. Other times it writhed as if alive, casting long shadows that stretched across the wasteland like grasping fingers. The guardsman could not decide whether it was calling them closer or warning them away, but he could not turn back. None of them could. On the second day they encountered others, stragglers from different regiments, their uniforms torn and fouled with filth, their banners long lost. Yet all of them were walking the same path, eyes locked on the same glow. The meeting should have been joyous, brothers in arms reunited amid ruin. Instead it was silent, cautious. Each group circled the other warily, as though unsure whether the faces before them were human or masks for something else. In the end, they merged without words, the two broken columns flowing together, drawn by a gravity none of them could resist. The guardsmen listened as whispers spread through the ranks. Some claimed that the fire marked a landing site of the Adeptus Custodes themselves, sent forth from Terra to judge who among the guards still carried loyalty in their hearts. Others whispered that it was no fire at all, but the Astronomicon itself piercing through the clouds to guide them, proof that the Emperor's gaze lingered on this cursed battlefield. And darker voices murmured that it was a trap, a lure set by the great enemy, bait for souls already cracked by hunger and despair. That night, they camped in the ruins of a manufactorum, its walls shattered by bombardment, its machinery twisted and blackened, fires guttered in broken oil drums, their smoke clinging low. The guardsman tried to rest, but sleep came with visions. He dreamed of a vast hall of golden light, of a throne so immense it dwarfed mountains, and of a figure seated upon it veiled in radiance. At first he thought it was the Emperor, but when the figure raised its head, he saw Henrik's face staring back, smiling through eyes that glowed like burning coals. He woke with a cry, his throat raw, only to find others had stirred as well, whispering of dreams not their own. In the morning they met the prophet. He emerged from the shadows of the manufactorum, clad in a tattered officer's coat, his skin pale as parchment, his eyes fever bright. He spoke with the confidence of command, though no insignia marked his rank. "The Emperor tests us," he declared, his voice carrying over the broken walls. "He casts us into the crucible to see who will endure. The fire ahead is his beacon, his trial. Those who reach it shall ascend beyond the weakness of flesh." The men drank in his words as though parched. Some wept, others raised their weapons skyward in trembling salute. The guardsman listened in silence, his heart torn. The prophet's voice rang with conviction, but behind it he heard the same rhythm that had haunted the trenches, that slow, steady thrum from the earth. Still, doubt was a luxury few could afford. In the absence of command, faith filled the void, even if it was faith misplaced. That night they marched again, the prophet at their head. He led with a staff fashioned from a broken laser gun, its barrel capped with a skull that glimmered in the firelight. He sang as he walked, and the soldiers joined him, their voices ragged but strong, echoing across the ruins like a choir of the damned. The guardsman marched among them, lips sealed, his mind clawing at the question he dared not speak. Was the prophet a messenger of the Emperor, or merely another mask for chaos? When dawn came, the fire was closer. Its light painted the clouds blood red, casting long shadows over the huddled column of soldiers. The guardsman felt the pull stronger than ever, a weight on his chest that dragged him forward step after step. Whatever lay at the heart of that fire, salvation or damnation, he knew there would be no turning away. The closer they drew, the more the fire became something else entirely. From afar it had been a distant beacon, a singular glow against the choking dark. But now, looming on the horizon, it resolved into a vast sprawl of flames rising from shattered spires and twisted wreckage. It was no mere campfire, no pyre set by men. It was a cathedral of fire, an inferno shaped into towers and arches, as though the ruins of some long-lost shrine had been remade in living flame. The guardsman's throat tightened. The air stank of ash and oil, of something metallic that burned his tongue when he drew breath. Yet the others pressed forward eagerly, their eyes wide with hunger and awe. Some fell to their knees, sobbing, arms stretched toward the pyre as if toward a holy relic. Others chanted broken hymns, voices cracked but fervent, words twisting in their mouths into phrases the guardsman did not recognize. At the forefront strode the prophet, his pale skin glowing in the fire's light, his skull-topped staff raised high. He proclaimed the flames to be the crown of the ascendant, the emperor's trial made manifest. He spoke of how only those who walked into the fire would be judged worthy, how beyond the flames lay not death but rebirth. His voice grew hoarse as he shouted, but no one doubted him. The column surged forward like pilgrims approaching a sacred relic, driven by faith or desperation, or both. The guardsman followed, though every instinct screamed for caution. He gripped his laser gun, fingers slick with sweat. The closer they drew, the more he saw within the fire. Shapes moving, vast and indistinct, as though figures danced behind the curtain of flame. He could not tell whether they were angels or demons. Each glimpse contradicted the last. Winged silhouettes that looked like custodians one moment, then towering horned monstrosities the next. His eyes watered, his vision blurred, but the images burned themselves into his mind. They reached the base of the inferno by nightfall. The ground there was scorched black, cracked like the surface of some dying world. Heat blasted against them in waves so intense that armor plates warped and lasgun casings hissed where sweat dripped onto them. Yet still the men pressed closer, some collapsing into the dirt only to crawl forward on hands and knees, faces blistering, skin peeling. None turned back. None questioned. The prophet raised his staff high and cried out, "Now, brothers, now is the hour of our testing. Cast off the flesh, for the Emperor calls us into his fire." And with that, he strode forward, walking straight into the inferno. The guardsman's heart pounded as the flames swallowed the prophet. For a moment he saw the man outlined within the blaze, arms raised in triumph, his body unburned. Then the vision twisted. The prophet's flesh melted from his bones, his skull split with a shriek, and yet his laughter echoed louder than the roar of fire. The men cheered, believing him transfigured, believing him ascended. One by one they followed. Soldiers threw themselves into the fire with cries of devotion, their voices rising in a chorus that dissolved into screams. The guardsman staggered back, horror clawing at his chest. He saw bodies thrashing in the flames, skin blackening, eyes bursting. Yet behind the curtain of fire, their shapes moved differently. Some rose, impossibly staggering upright again, their limbs warped, their shadows no longer human. He could not tell whether they were ascending or falling into corruption. Around him, men pushed forward, trampling those too weak to rise. Some clutched his arms, begging him to join them, their faces alight with a fervor brighter than the flames. "Come, brother," they cried. "Do not deny the Emperor's gift. Step into the fire and be remade." The guardsman wrenched free, gasping, his mind a storm of doubt and terror. The fire roared louder as though it had a voice of its own, whispering to him, promising release from pain, release from hunger, release from the endless war. The words coiled in his skull like a parasite, pressing against his reason. And then he saw Henrik again. The vision flickered at the heart of the fire, his friend, whole and smiling, clad in shining armor, his arms open as if to welcome him. "You've carried this burden long enough," the figure said, though no lips moved. "Lay it down. Step forward. Join me." The guardsman fell to his knees, tears scalding his face. Every part of him longed to believe, longed to step forward into the fire, to end the torment and embrace what might be waiting. Yet some stubborn spark within him, whether faith or defiance he could not say, held him back. He clutched his laser gun like a lifeline, staring into the flames as men screamed and vanished one by one. The fire raged, the prophet's laughter echoed, and the guardsman realized with hollow dread that whatever waited within those flames, it was not salvation. When dawn bled across the ash-choked sky, the inferno still raged. Its flames had not dimmed in the night, nor had they consumed the wreckage that birthed them. The guardsman sat crouched among the blackened rocks, his skin blistered from the heat, his ears ringing with the echoes of screams that had gone silent hours before. The ground was littered with charred fragments, the remains of men who had hurled themselves willingly into the fire. Yet the fire seemed unchanged, undiminished, as if the flesh it devoured had only fed its hunger. He clutched his laser gun, though its charge pack was nearly spent, the indicator glowing faintly red. It gave him no comfort. Nothing did. His mind swam with images he could not banish. Henrik smiling from within the blaze, the prophet's twisted laughter, the shadows that rose and moved like figures reborn. He pressed his forehead to the weapon stock, muttering the litany of protection under his breath, though the words tasted hollow. The Emperor was distant here, his light drowned beneath this fire. The silence after the screams was worse than the noise had been. In that silence, shapes began to emerge. From the curtain of flame, figures stepped forth. At first they were vague, outlines wavering in the heat. But then the Guardsmen saw their forms with brutal clarity, and at least they had been men once. Their skin was blackened, yet beneath the burns pulsed veins of molten light. Their eyes glowed like coals, their mouths split in rictus grins that stretched too wide. Armor plates fused into flesh, laser guns melted into arms, fingers twisted into blades of bone and iron. They stumbled forward on unsteady limbs, yet each step grew surer, as though the fire had reforged them. The Guardsman's breath caught. He whispered a prayer, but his voice broke and the words faltered. These were not saints. They were not the Emperor's chosen. They were something else, something blasphemous. Chaos had claimed them. The prophet walked among them, or what was left of him. His robe still clung in tatters, but his body was stretched and warped, elongated by some obscene hand. His skull-topped staff now burned with its own fire, and his voice carried with terrible strength as he proclaimed their transformation. See how the Emperor remakes us. See how we rise above the chains of flesh. His words rang in the Guardsman's ears like poison. The newly forged creatures echoed him, chanting in cracked voices, their mouths spilling sparks with every word. The Guardsman knew then that he could not stay. To remain was to fall, whether into the flames or into madness. Yet to flee was nearly impossible. His strength was failing, his body a husk, his supplies long gone. But the choice was no longer survival. It was something darker, whether to die as a man or to surrender and become whatever monstrosity crawled forth from the fire. He rose unsteadily, his legs trembling beneath him. The creatures did not notice him at first, their attention fixed on their prophet. But as he turned, one lifted its molten gaze and locked eyes with him. Recognition flashed in its face. The Guardsman froze. Beneath the burns and the warping, he knew the man. It was Sergeant Kor, the one who had marched at the head of their column, who had led prayers each night when the stars were gone. Kor's lips cracked open in a grin and his voice rasped. "Brother, join us!" The Guardsman staggered back, his heart hammering. Kor stepped closer, his fused weapon arm lifting, not in threat but in invitation. The heat rolling off him was unbearable, the stench of scorched flesh enough to choke. Behind him, more of the creatures turned, their glowing eyes fixing on the Guardsman, their mouths shaping the same words. "Brother, join us!" His laser gun felt suddenly useless, a toy in his hands. To fire it would be mercy, not defiance. Yet he raised it anyway, the stock digging into his shoulder, his finger trembling on the trigger. He thought of Henrik, of the laughter in the fire, of every comrade who had fallen to hunger, to despair, to this final blasphemy. His throat burned as he shouted, not a prayer, not a litany, but a raw and broken word torn from his chest. "No!" The creatures advanced, their steps in unison, their chant rising like a choir of ash. The prophet's staff blazed brighter, and the fire behind them surged as though feeding on their faith. The Guardsman's laser gun discharged with a crack, the red beam cutting through the smoke, striking Kor square in the chest. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Kor staggered, a hole burning through his molten flesh. He did not fall. He laughed, and in that laughter, the Guardsman understood that his weapon, his training, his faith, none of it could destroy what the fire had made. The laughter spread. It began with Kor, but soon every figure that had emerged from the fire joined him. It rolled across the scorched ground like thunder, sharp and jagged, each voice carrying its own pitch, some guttural, others shrill, together weaving a sound that was neither human nor divine. It was mockery given form. The Guardsman's laser gun clicked as he fired again, then again, the beams hissing against charred armor and blistered flesh. But they only staggered for moments before rising straighter, stronger, as though each strike only hardened them further. He backed away, step by unsteady step until his heel struck the lip of a crater. He stumbled, nearly falling, and in that instant one of the creatures lunged forward. Its fingers, no, blades now, fused and serrated, swiped at him. He flung himself aside, the edge grazing his flak vest, tearing the fabric, searing his skin. The pain jolted him awake, reminding him he was still flesh, still mortal, and that was both curse and salvation, for they were no longer truly alive. He could see it in their eyes, burning with a fire that was not their own. He scrambled across the dirt, his palms raw, his breath a ragged rasp. Behind him, the prophet's voice rose higher, commanding the horde forward. They obeyed, but not with the unity of soldiers, rather like zealots, like worshippers drawn by hunger. They reached for him not to kill but to pull him into their embrace, to drag him into the fire's communion. That thought horrified him more than death itself. To die was inevitable. To be unmade, to be reborn in that parody of flesh was worse than damnation. A memory struck him, sharp as shrapnel. Henrik, laughing in the mess hall before deployment, speaking of home, of family. That laughter had been warm, human. This sound was its opposite, a grotesque inversion. The Guardsman clenched his teeth, forcing himself to remember the difference. He could not let their echo rewrite the past. He would not surrender the last remnants of what it meant to be himself. The ground shook as the creatures advanced, each step pounding ash into the air. The Guardsman stumbled into the crater, sliding down its wall. At the bottom lay wreckage. An old Chimera transport burned out, its hull split open. He crawled inside, the stench of rust and cooked metal thick in the air. His hands brushed across a half-melted crate, and within he found it. Frag grenades, their casing scorched but intact. His heart leapt, then faltered. Most were useless, their activation runes burned away, but one still bore the faint green glow of life. He cradled it, the weight heavy and certain in his palm. The creatures were at the crater's edge now, peering down at him, their eyes glowing, their mouths chanting his name, though he had never spoken it aloud. He realized then that they weren't speaking to him as a man. They were calling to his soul, beckoning it to step free of its shell and join them. His stomach churned, his hands trembled. But the grenade was steady. He thought again of the Emperor, distant yet enduring. He thought of the prayers he had mumbled without conviction, the hymns he had sung half asleep, the promises he had never fully believed. Now with the fire closing in, he whispered one final plea, not for salvation, not for ascension, but for the strength to end as himself. The creatures slid down into the crater, their limbs scraping against the steel, sparks flaring. The prophet stood above them, his staff blazing, his mouth split in a grin so wide it seemed ready to tear his face apart. "Come, child," he called, his voice filled with triumphant certainty. "The Emperor has chosen you. Burn and be remade!" The Guardsman pulled the pin. For a heartbeat, time stilled. He felt the weight of the grenade, the cold metal against his burned fingers, the certainty of what he had chosen. The fire roared around him. The creatures reached forward. The prophet lifted his staff in victory, and then he closed his eyes. The explosion tore the world apart. Heat engulfed him. Not the slow devouring of the fire, but the sharp purity of promethium and shrapnel. Metal screamed as the wreckage blew outward, ripping through flesh and bone. The blast hurled the creatures back, their molten veins spilling across the dirt, their voices twisting from laughter to shrieks. The shockwave slammed against the prophet, toppling him, his staff tumbling from his grasp. For a moment the fire wavered, its towers of flame shuddering as though struck by doubt. The Guardsman felt none of it. The blast was swift, merciful in a way the fire could never be. Flesh burned, bone shattered, thought dissolved into nothingness. He had chosen. He had denied them their prize. And as the darkness closed in, he thought, just for a moment, that he heard another voice, distant but steady, like the toll of a bell through endless night. Not laughter, not mockery, a voice of command, sharp and unyielding. The kind he had once heard on parade grounds beneath the Imperial Aquila. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps it was the Emperor, or perhaps it was nothing at all, but it was enough. When the dust settled, the inferno still smoldered, though its towers of flame had fractured, reduced to flickering pillars of heat. Ash drifted through the sky like snow, settling on the blackened earth, the twisted hulls of Chimera transports, and the broken bodies of the fire-forged. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional hiss of cooling metal and the distant echo of something alive, somewhere beyond the wreckage. The Guardsman stirred, his body bruised, scorched and bleeding but still breathing. He crawled from the crater, every movement agony, every step a negotiation with pain. Around him lay the remnants of his brothers in arms, many unrecognizable, melted into grotesque forms by the fire. Some still twitched, as if the flames had left behind fragments of life that refused to die. Others were simply gone, nothing remaining but scorched earth where bodies had once knelt. The battlefield was a graveyard, yet eerily quiet, as though even chaos had recoiled from the force he had unleashed. The guardsman stumbled through the wreckage, searching for signs of the prophet, of Henrik, of anyone who had shared the march into the fire. None remained. The prophet's staff lay in a twisted heap, embers clinging to the skull atop it. Henrik's form was gone entirely, vanished into the explosion, or perhaps into some fate beyond mortal comprehension. For a moment, the guardsman thought he saw a figure at the edge of his vision, golden light shimmering where smoke and ash met, but when he blinked, it vanished. Perhaps a vision, perhaps the Emperor's mercy, or perhaps a final trick of the fire. The ground beneath his boots shivered as if alive. Fragments of the fire still lingered in the earth, a heat that throbbed in his chest and pressed on his mind. He realized with a cold clarity that though the fire had been broken, it had not been destroyed. Its echo remained, coiled in the soil and the wind, a memory of what had been, a warning of what could rise again. Chaos had been denied its immediate feast, but the war was not over. It would wait. It would hunger. It would remember. The guardsman paused atop a ridge looking down at the wasteland. The fog that had once been so thick had thinned, revealing the skeletal remains of manufactorums, splintered gun emplacements, and trenches filled with ash. He knew he was the last, or nearly the last, of his regiment. Every thought of camaraderie, every shared meal and prayer, every whispered fear now belonged to memory alone. The world felt vast, empty, and indifferent, yet he still drew breath. Survival, he realized, was no longer a matter of orders or faith. It was a test of will, a stubborn refusal to yield to forces far greater than himself. He walked slowly, each step a conscious effort, feeling the heat of the fire and the soil beneath him. The whispers had not returned, though their memory lingered like a stain. He did not dare speak aloud, for words now seemed dangerous, capable of summoning shadows where none should tread. Yet the silence offered no comfort either. It was the quiet after a storm, fragile and deceptive, holding within it the possibility of return. And then he saw it. In the distance, the faint glow of a city, lights flickering on the horizon. Not the fire, not the twisted cathedral of flame, but something built by human hands. Perhaps a bastion, a fortress, a place where the dead might be mourned and the living might gather. He did not know who remained, if any, or if the light was real or another test, but it was enough to move toward. With a final glance at the blackened battlefield, the guardsman set his jaw and began walking. Each step carried the weight of everything he had seen: the loss, the madness, the fire, the prophecy, and the vision of Henrik, laughing from a world he could never reach again. He did not know what awaited him at the city, whether safety or further torment. He only knew that he would face it as a man, flesh and will intact, whatever cost that carried. The fire had ended, but its shadow would remain forever. In every whisper of wind, in the heat that clung to the soil, in the memory of those who had fallen and risen in flame, it lingered. And the guardsman walked on, carrying the weight of all that had been and all that might yet come, into the uncertain light ahead.